Greetings, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading The Negro Pilgrimage in America by C. Eric Lincoln.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where black problems are addressed with black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondent, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
Greetings, Anthony McPhail. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. The Negro Pilgrimage in America by C. Eric Lincoln. Page 1. If the American Negro is to be seen in proper perspective as a part of contemporary American society, it is important to know something of his origins and the peculiar set of circumstances which has marked his pilgrimage from bondsman to responsible citizen. And if he is ever to be appreciated as an American, the Negro must be seen in the full context of America's growth and development. American history is his history, and his story is part of America's. Any account of what happened in America which does not fully reflect the Negro's presence and activities is to that degree unfaithful to reality. The Negro pilgrimage begins in Africa, the land of the rootstock of American Negroes. From West Africa they came as slaves, from Guinea, from Calabar, from Gambia and Angola. From 100 tribes and 1,000 villages down to the waiting ships out of Lisbon, Cadiz, London, Liverpool, Newport, and Boston, they marched, chained together in coffles. The Europeans who came to America came in search of a new and more complete freedom. The Africans came because the last vestige of their freedom had been taken away. The Europeans came in search of new ways to exploit the full potential of their humanity. The Africans came under conditions which denied even their basic humanity. The children of West Africa and the sons and daughters of Europe were destined for separate roles in the making of America. For the white Europeans, America was to be a land of the free, where the self-evident truths of human equality were to be sufficient ground for individual liberty and universal justice. For the Black African, America was to mean 250 years of slavery. After that would come the belated discovery that even with freedom, there were social and moral factors which would qualify that freedom for yet another 100 years and more. It was of no significance to colonial America that many of the Africans she held as slaves came directly from or were descendants of cultures which were by any objective standards highly developed. Unfortunately, the slave period in America was a period of racial and cultural provincialism, oblivious to any values not consistent with or conforming to those prevailing in Western Europe. The African political, artistic, economic, religious, and linguistic experience was not European and was thus judged to be of no consequence for the New World, which was organized in terms of the European experience. Did you hear that? The New World was organized by Europeans for Europeans. Africans were prohibited from practicing and developing their art, their language, their religion, their family life, and for want of appreciation and practice, whatever was distinctively African soon died out in America. We cannot hope to resurrect a substantial representation of the African past in a work of this limited scope, but we can hope to offer a look at some characteristic forms of African cultural experience. Since most of the slaves sold in America came from West Africa, we may justifiably restrict our inquiry to that area, although to treat the whole of West Africa as a single culture does further violence to the whole matter of African identity. One of the historic problems of the slaves and their descendants was that, in the practical matter of grouping slaves for sale or for work, the slave masters paid no attention to cultural or linguistic differences. The suffering of the slave was thereby made more acute because his sense of personal identity was shattered. Even among other Blacks, he could not always communicate. Greetings, Forecast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm so glad you're here. Over 800 indigenous languages are spoken on the African continent. To this day, in the modern state of Nigeria alone, 200 languages are used. For the African, the spoken language is his history, his newspaper, his link to a tribe. In the local marketplaces, oral literature developed into an elaborate tradition. Some of our American Negro folklore has its roots in this oral tradition which came with the slaves from Africa. Music and dancing also play important roles in African life, both as part of religious ceremonials and as a recreational activity. African music is complex in scale and rhythm, with arrangements usually featuring responsive choral patterns. Instrumentation makes great use of the drum, although woodwind instruments are also used widely. In addition to a highly developed oral literature and music, West Africans are noted for their original sculpture. The wood carvings, bronzes, stone carvings, and ivory work of the 16th and 17th centuries have had a strong influence on modern Western art. Africans also developed a highly intricate system of metalwork utilizing the continent's vast mineral ore deposits. It is more important to realize that while there was always a strong native religion in West Africa, by the early 1400s, Islam had become a powerful religious as well as political and economic force. By 1492, the great Negro kingdom of Songhai had already conquered most of West Africa. Songhai accepted the religion of Islam reluctantly at first, later, through her conquest, helped to spread it over much of West Africa. Songhai was one of the last great empires of West Africa. One of the first was Ghana, already an ancient civilization at the time of the Norman invasion of England in 1066. A history of Ghana written by the Muslim scholar al-Bukhari in 1067 presents a detailed picture of the wealth, the pomp, and circumstance of the court of the reigning African king Taraminin. As head of the state religion, Taraminin was himself not a Muslim, but he permitted the Muslim traders from the north to establish a small Muslim town convenient to the capital. Under his rule, Ghana pacified all the surrounding territory, thereby ensuring the safety of trade routes to North Africa and to the Nile Valley. So, as you can see, it wasn't about integrating, it was always about trade and commerce. Al-Bukhari wrote that the king of Ghana is the master of a large empire and of a formidable power. He could put 200,000 warriors into the field, including some 40,000 archers. When the king gives audience to his people, al-Bukhari wrote, he sits in a pavilion around which stand 10 pages holding shields and gold-mounted swords. On his right hand are the sons of the princes of the empire, splendidly clad with gold plaited in their hair. The governor of the city was seated on the ground in front of the king, and all around him are his counselors in the same position. The gate of the chamber is guarded by dogs of an excellent breed. They wear collars of gold and silver ornamented with metals. So al-Bukhari was describing the court of this king to say that everybody there was dripping in gold. And he had so much money, even his dogs had gold and silver collars. 500 years later, another writer named Muhammad Kadi in the book called The Tariq al-Fatash, or The Chronicle of the Seeker, writes of another king of Ghana named Kanissa I, who reigned in the 7th century and who owned 1,000 blooded horses, each of which had 3 personal attendants and only slept on a carpet with the silken rope for a halter. Such legends, while probably magnified by time and distance, do offer some perspective on the grandeur and magnificence of the brilliant African kingdoms which flourished for more than 1,000 years. Successor to Ghana, and even greater in wealth and power and extent, was the Empire of Mali, which developed from the little state of Kangaba, once a vassal state of Ghana. Mansa Musa ascended the throne in 1312 and during the next 25 years made Mali into one of the largest empires in the world. He brought the Western Sudan under a unified system of law, gave dependable protection to trade routes, and expanded his rule over such cities as Timbuktu, which was an important center of learning, and Walata on the southern Sahara. Later, Mansa Musa embraced Islam and in 1324 made a historic pilgrimage to Mecca. It is said that he took with him and gave away so much gold as to upset the market in Cairo through which he passed. He is described by El Amri, a contemporary scholar living in Cairo during the period, as the most powerful, the richest, the most fortunate, and the most feared by his enemies. Ambassadors from Mali represented their government in Morocco, Cairo, and other centers of power. Scholars from the University of Timbuktu were received at the great universities in Egypt and Spain, and Mansa Musa brought back with him from Egypt scholars, architects, and men of science to enhance his court and to further facilitate his empire building in West Africa. The empire of Songhai flourished in West Africa until modern times, although its founding dates back to the ancient city of Gao on the Niger River almost 1,000 years ago. Under the rule of Di Kasoi, Songhai began a slow period of growth, and after 300 years, Gao was wealthy enough to attract the eye of Mansa Musa, the great king of Mali, who sent his generals to subdue it. But Mali was already overextended, and Gao regained her independence in 1375. The king who established Songhai as a great empire was Sunni Ali, who ruled it from 1464 to 1492, the year Columbus is said to have discovered America. From 1493 to 1529, the empire was ruled by Askia Muhammad, or Askia the Great, under whose rule the boundaries of Songhai were extended even further, so that she eventually came to rival the Empire of Mali in size and importance. While Songhai subdued most of the neighboring people, the Hausa and Maasai tribes were able to repel the incursions of her mighty armies. These fabled warriors held out against repeated invasions by other Muslim groups too, and later stopped, temporarily, even the European conquerors with their modern sophisticated weapons. The Hausa and the Maasai were finally overrun by the Fulani, a Negro Muslim tribal group which struck from the Sahara in the 19th century. The Fulani were in turn eventually defeated in 1861 by the British, who thereafter established the colony of Nigeria, which is one of the foremost states of modern West Africa to this very day. As we have already noted, the economy, art forms, political systems, and religions of the West African people ranged widely. However, these unique traditions could not withstand the corroding effect of European colonial expansion, especially as Africa became a prime source for slave labor needed to fill the demands of settlement in the New World. Just as there are misconceptions about the cultural background of the slaves brought to America from West Africa, so there are misconceptions about the way slaves were acquired to supply the markets of the New World. The general pattern was as follows. Europeans usually made contacts with the highly organized political kingdoms on the west coast of Africa, and it was these kingdoms which supplied them with slaves. These coastal empires had long engaged in periodic wars with the inland people who were generally weaker in political and military organization. Prisoners were usually taken on a small scale, but before the European contact, there is no evidence that the sale of slaves was an established practice. Only when Europeans began to purchase slaves for commercial purposes did slave wars become common. What had once been a system of limited political warfare now quickly became an organized system of raids into the interior to capture entire native populations who would then be sold on the coast to European traders. The traders supplied the slave raiders with guns and ammunition and encouraged even larger raids to meet the needs of the burgeoning slave markets in the Americas. Probably not until much later, sometime in the late 1700s, were slaves actually taken in large numbers from the more highly developed nations of West Africa, and then only as a result of defeat of one major kingdom by another. There is a traditional belief that West African slaves were much desired for their highly skilled labor potential. While it is undoubtedly true that many artisans and other skilled craftsmen were taken from the developed civilizations of West Africa, most of the captured blacks came from the more remote interior villages because European slave traders were not particularly interested in whether the slaves were skilled or not. They just wanted slaves. By accident or plan, Portuguese and Spanish slavers helped preserve a considerable amount of African culture in their American colonies. Their general practice of keeping slave families intact was invaluable in this regard. The Catholic Church played an important role in the Portuguese and Spanish treatment of slaves, especially in South America and other places where Catholicism was the dominant religion. In ordering that religious instruction be offered to the slaves, the church helped reduce illiteracy and increase the ease with which the slaves adapted to their new and hostile environment. Then, too, very few Spanish and Portuguese women immigrated to the New World, and the church encouraged marriages between Iberian colonialists and both Negro and Indian women. By 1630, Africans had established a successful state, the Republic of Palmyra, in northern Brazil. The town of Palmyra, 60 miles southwest of the Brazilian coastal city of Recife, is still in existence to this day. Although the African family was virtually destroyed by the peculiar form of slavery that took place in North America, some vestigial remnants of African culture have survived here. For example, many Negro mothers retained a West African tradition in naming of the children. Many slave children, especially those born along the Georgia and South Carolina coasts, were named for their time of birth, such as a month or a day or even a time of day. In some areas, slaves retained certain elements of their African religions and incorporated them later into Christian rituals and practice. In general, however, the North American slave was so violently and so completely severed from his past that the American Negroes have retained few cultural links to their ancestral homeland. One of the greatest tragedies of the slave system in America was its effect on slave families. Marriage among slaves was not recognized by law, and stable relationships were discouraged because they tended to interfere with the ready availability of the slave for sale or procreation. Sometimes common law marriages were permitted, although separation of wives and husbands was not subject to any rights inherent in such relationships. It developed inevitably that the absence of a stable marriage relationship respected by the slaveholders, the slave families in North America came to be dominated by the mother into whose sole care the children were committed. Among South American and West Indian Negroes, where the rupture of the family through sale of one of the parents was less frequent, a patriarchal system of family relationships was the rule. So they think that our matriarchal hierarchy is directly related to the slave trade, although there is evidence that shows that women in ancient African cultures and civilizations were venerated and were actually the leaders of their families. But all of history is true. All of history is not true for just you. So you have to remember that you need to know who you are. Chapter 2, Early Bondage. The first Negroes to arrive in the Western Hemisphere were not the 20 niggers traded in Jamestown Harbor by a Dutch captain in 1619. A Negro, Pedro Alonzo Nino, was the navigator of the Nina, one of the ships Christopher Columbus is said to have sailed into the New World in 1492. Neflo de Olana was among 30 Negroes serving with Balboa when the Spanish explorer discovered the Pacific Ocean. Cortez led a company of Negro explorers into Mexico, where they planted and harvested the New World's first wheat crop, and Esteban, a Negro scout for the explorer Narvaez, was the first non-Indian to penetrate what is now Arizona. Hundreds of Negroes served as explorers in the Jesuit-led French parties that entered Canada, as well as in later expeditions that probed the upper regions of the Mississippi River. One Jean Baptiste Point du Sable was the founder of Chicago. With such a noble and heroic beginning, how did the Negro become a slave in America? In anticipating this question, let us examine some historical aspects of slavery. World slavery. Initially, slaves were not identified with any particular race or group of people. The earliest known slaves became slaves by virtues of being prisoners of war. As with all enduring social customs, slavery underwent changes in style. At first, prisoner slaves were held as the property of the victorious state. Later, with the organization of slave markets, individual ownership of slaves became one of the first status symbols. In Europe, the 4th and 5th centuries AD saw serfdom replace the former practice of chattel slavery. The serf was a peasant bound to the land of his lord and working without pay. Being attached permanently to one family, the serf enjoyed the advantage of over the chattel slave. The serf was able to keep his own family intact. During the Middle Ages, religious differences formed the rationale for slavery. Christians were enslaved by Muslims, and later Christians themselves enslaved Muslims and other non Christians. The American experience. The first English settlement in America was established at Jamestown in 1607. The English colonies were desperate for labor and needed to push inland to clear the forests and cultivate the land. There was a short-lived attempt to use Indians as laborers, and hundreds were enslaved. However, the Indians proved unadaptable to large-scale farming operations, and many died in the fields. The search for labor then focused upon white Englishmen who were brought to the colonies as indentured servants or bondsmen. Most bondsmen were extremely poor, many having been taken from European debtors' prisons. Others were convicted felons. Many poor Englishmen were so eager to escape the repressive class structure of their home islands that they signed contracts as bondmen in return for passage to America. Bondsmen usually served for 7 years, although some were bound for twice that time. Bondsmen were not chattels in the same sense as were slaves. It should be noted, however, that bondsmen could be, and often were, traded and sold to new holders. They were permitted to be litigants in the colonial courts, and a few bondsmen sued their holders for illegal detention. This was especially true of those who were sold to new holders who attempted by various devices to lengthen their period of bound service. But the majority of bondsmen fulfilled their contracts and, in accordance with existing laws and practices, were then released. When the supply of voluntary indentured servants began to dwindle, it became a widespread practice to kidnap English men, women, and children to be sold into bondage in the New World. So, see, they will even do it to themselves. They will kidnap, and they were kidnapping white men, women, and children to sell them into bondage in the New World. By the middle of the 17th century, approximately 12,000 white bondsmen were serving in Virginia alone. The importation of Negro bondsmen dates from 1619, when 20 Negroes were purchased by English colonists from a Dutch warship docked at Jamestown, Virginia. It must be emphasized that those 20 human beings came ashore as bondsmen, not as slaves, and Virginia court records support this fact. In 1624, John Phillip, one of the 20 Negroes, was a witness in a lawsuit. Under then existing English law, a slave had no legal status. He could not sue, be sued, or give testimony. Other records show that the child of one couple among the 20 Negroes was later baptized a Christian. English law provided that persons who had been baptized became enfranchised. Conversion to Christianity was the first step many slaves took towards what they hoped would be eventual freedman status. As the colonies grew and prospered, it became increasingly clear that the supply of bondsmen would be inadequate. To encourage white immigration to America, the English government enacted a series of new laws to improve working conditions and to make it easier for bondsmen to become landowners after their service ended. Substantial numbers of both white and black bondsmen abandoned agriculture and became industrial workers. Other bondsmen were impatient for freedom and ran away from their masters. It was relatively easy for a white bondsman to move into another community where he could become a trapper or a fur trader, but it was impossible for a Negro bondsman to blend into the populace of a strange neighborhood because of his darker skin. This raises a psychological point that remains valid to this day. Because the Negro was different in appearance, many whites justified their different treatment of him. That the vast majority of Negroes were non-Christians in a proclaimed Christian land added another rationalization for slavery. 51 years after the Jamestown venture, Virginia law reflected the abandonment of attempts to bring white bondsmen to America. A new law provided that all bondsmen coming to Virginia by sea shall be slaves for their lives, and that those who came by land were to serve a period of apprenticeship. In 1667, another Virginia law had repealed the earlier statute enfranchising Negroes who converted to Christianity. So, see, they changed the laws as they became more diabolical in their plots and in their plans. Finally, in 1682, Virginia law reduced all non-Christians, including later converts, to permanent slave status. And they were doing all of this to ensure that they had workers for their agricultural and industrial pursuits. In 1708, Virginia held about 12,000 Negro slaves, while approximately 1,000 were being imported each year. By 1782, the Negro slave population of the state had reached 260,000. During the years between 1715 and 1750, slave importations for all the colonies increased from an average of 2,500 to an average of 7,500 per year. For the more enlightened colonial leaders, the fight against slavery was part of the fight for basic freedom. Throughout the entire Revolutionary War era, Ben Franklin raised a powerful voice against slavery. But remember, he held slaves. In 1774, Thomas Jefferson included in his summary view of rights of British America a statement that all the colonies wanted slavery abolished. Jefferson also accused England of subverting colonial attempts to end the slave trade, but that was because there were still a number of white slaves. Because remember, he didn't let Sally Hemings, his concubine, go. That same year, largely through the efforts of Franklin and Jefferson, the Continental Congress agreed to bar the importation of slaves after December 1, 1775, but they didn't bar slavery, and so they started breeding farms. While the Continental Congress was drafting the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson submitted to that body that John Adams called a vehement denunciation of slavery, but Jefferson failed to convince Congress to make abolition a part of the historic 1776 document. Although the Negro did not have the same rights as the white colonialists, the Revolutionary period produced several distinguished Negroes who contributed to America's cultural growth. Jupiter Hammond, a slave on Long Island, wrote poetry widely read throughout the colonies. Hammond tried to purchase his freedom but was unable to raise enough money. When he failed to gain his own liberty, he finally accepted slavery as his personal misfortune, but continued to urge manumission of young Negroes. Gustavus Vassa was kidnapped by slavers when he was 11 years old. He was brought to America. Vassa became the slave of a Philadelphia merchant who later freed him. Vassa moved to England and wrote an autobiography that to this day remains one of the most widely read and detailed accounts of the life of an 18th century slave. Greetings, Brother Bakari. How are you tonight? The forecast says Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson claimed they wanted to end slavery because they wanted to kick blacks out and make it only a white nation, but they never gave up their slaves. Exactly. They never gave up their slaves. Phyllis Wheatley, Phyllis Wheatley, born in Africa around 1753, was enslaved and taken to Boston, Massachusetts. Her masters recognized the girl's intelligence, and young Phyllis was taught to read and write. Her first book, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, was published shortly after her manumission in 1773. So she was about 20 years old. She died 9 years later, but her fame continued and she remains one of New England's best known poets. There are many other prominent Negroes during the Revolutionary era. John Durham, the first Negro physician in America, Onesimus, a slave who encouraged smallpox inoculations in America because he recalled how successful such treatment had been in Africa. Paul Coffey, a Negro who amassed a fortune as a Massachusetts merchant and ship owner, and Lucy Terry, a slave whose first poetry was published about 7 years before Phyllis Wheatley was born. Probably the most accomplished Negro of the Revolutionary period was Benjamin Banneker, a free-born Negro born in 1731. Banneker was a science and mathematician of such ability that he was one of the first Americans to predict a solar eclipse accurately. Later, he published a series of almanacs which bear his face and likeness, and you can see that he was a full-blooded, all-black man. He didn't have any admixture in him at all. So don't let them tell you that. Later, he published a series of almanacs which gained him recognition and support of Thomas Jefferson, among other prominent whites. On Jefferson's recommendation, the Maryland-born Negro was appointed by the President, Washington, to the commission that surveyed and laid out what is now the District of Columbia. The tension between England and the colonies erupted in violence in Boston, Massachusetts on March 5th, 1770. A detachment of British soldiers fired into a group of civilians gathered on historic State Street. Crispus Attucks, a Negro who was mulatto, sailor, sought to rally the confused Americans in the face of British fire, was the first to give his life for America. Later, however, when General George Washington assumed command of the Continental Army in July of 1775, he issued an order excluding all Negroes from service in the war. The British countered by offering freedom to all slaves who joined the Crown's forces. And that moment in history is why so many slaves will sing praises to Queen Victoria, and you will find older people, people who are centenarians, who are in their who are 100 years old or who lived during that time, they will name their children Queen Victoria, King Albert, things of that nature. The British move forced Washington to modify his position and permitted free Negroes to serve, but all slaves remained barred from fighting for America's freedom or their own. The Battle of Bunker Hill produced two Negro heroes in the colonial struggle for liberty. It was a Negro, Peter Salem, who shot Major Pitcairn, the British commander, during that bloody engagement. Salem shot him just as he was telling his troops, "The day is ours." Another heroic Negro, Salem Poor, was awarded a formal commendation by the Massachusetts legislature for behaving like an experienced officer as well as a brave and gallant soldier. By the end of the Revolutionary War, an estimated 5,000 Negro soldiers had served in the Continental Army. In most military groups, white and Negro troops served side by side. In addition, several all Negro combat units fought in the war, and one such unit was commanded by a Negro officer. A few free Negroes attained substantial financial success before and following the Revolutionary War. Many bought farms, and there was one recorded case of a free Negro who owned 30 Negro slaves. Generally, however, the free Negroes purchased small and usually exhausted plots of land that yielded neither quality nor quantity. Although they had escaped from an oppressive relationship with England themselves, the majority of the delegates of the Constitutional Convention of 1787 were openly pro slavery. So never let them tell you that they were all against slavery. They were openly pro slavery. As if to prove that fact to their heirs, the founding fathers provided in the Constitution for a 20-year extension of the slave trade, the only blot on an otherwise honorable document. Nevertheless, largely through the efforts of the Quakers and the Methodists, the manumission of slaves increased during the Revolutionary period. The first manumission statute was enacted by Maryland in 1752, although the motives for the law were not altogether humanitarian. Maryland was determined to control the actions of irresponsible slaveholders who abandoned their slaves for the community to support when they were old and were no longer able to work. The first years of the Republic saw the free Negro population grow very rapidly. Near the end of the 18th century, nearly 3 times as many Negroes were free as slaves, were slaves. Another factor accounts for the increase in the free Negro population. Many Negroes were born to free mothers and fathers. However, it is impossible to gauge accurately how many children were born of racially mixed parentage, the children of white women, servants, and slaves, or of slave mothers and white fathers. As early as 1662, the Virginia legislature had enacted the following law. Whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro woman shall be slave or free, all children born in this colony shall be bond or free according to the condition of the mother. Did you hear that? So if a black woman was raped by a white man and she had a child, that child was a slave because her mother was a slave. Later, Virginia enacted another law which provided that if a white woman married a Negro, she would serve an additional 5 years. In 1664, Maryland law provided that if a freeborn white woman married a slave, she became the servant of her husband's master so long as the husband lived. So they were doing a lot to prohibit these white women from indulging in black flesh. The law also provided that the children of such a couple became slaves at birth. This law, which made virtual slaves of certain white women, was later repealed to prevent the forced marriage of white women's servants to Negroes by unscrupulous masters. So they knew that they would take servant white girls and marry them to Negroes and force them to breed and intermarry just to make more slaves. Eventually, the white wives of Negroes and their children were elevated to freed status, and the large mulatto population among free Negroes was dramatic evidence of the massive miscegenation between whites and Negroes. By 1850, 37% of free Negroes in the United States were classified mulattoes. Many were the children of slave mothers whose white masters had freed their own offspring. Now, we're halfway through the chapter. Do you guys want to keep going, or do you want me to stop right there? Give me one moment. I think we should stop right there because it's been almost an hour. All right, I'm going to keep going. The cotton gin. In 1792, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin at an event which changed the base of the Southern economy. Cotton quickly became the major Southern crop. In order to grow enough cotton to meet the demand and to keep the cotton gins running, large numbers of workers were needed. This increased the demand for labor and it penetrated the South's reliance on slave labor economy. Once this change was set in motion, there was little hope that the South would give up on its slave holdings. On the contrary, it now had even more reason to hold on to what it had and to try to extend the practice. While it is undoubtedly true that the growth of King Cotton resulted in the expansion of slavery, even before 1792, slavery was the dominant social and economic way of life the Southerner was not anxious to change. So, as the cotton industry grew, the possibility of a peaceful solution to the slavery question was proportionately lessened. Now that slavery had an even larger economic base, the slave found himself caught ever more hopelessly in the toils of oppression with his circumstances increasingly difficult. More time and effort was spent in preventing him from escaping or in catching him if he did escape. Prices for healthy slaves were higher than they had ever been, and the owners worked their slaves harder to realize full returns on their investments. Since slavery had become big business, the possibility of political action to put an end to it became more remote. The full force of the South's political and economic power, reinforced by the efforts of those industrialists in the North and in England who had large sums of money invested in the Southern cotton industry, determinedly frustrated any abolitionist move. The stage was being set for a major confrontation, except for an occasional manumission, and the laws of manumission became increasingly severe. The typical slave would look for an outward on would could look forward only the typical slave could look forward only to manumission, save for the likely prospects of a successful revolt or escape, to giving his whole life to obedient service of his master. Slave revolts. One of the persistent American myths concerning the Negro slave is that he did nothing to protest his enslavement. This myth is so patently and demonstrably at variance with the facts. Although no single slave revolt succeeded, slave communities never lacked the contagion of revolt. Indeed, American history is marked with a series of slave revolts. Between 1663 and 1864, at least 109 separate slave revolts occurred on land, while between 1699 and 1845, 55 revolts took place on slave ships at sea. New York City was the scene of a massive slave uprising in the spring of 1712. Several whites were shot and buildings set afire before the militia quelled the insurrection. 21 Negroes were executed for the revolt. Another slave rebellion occurred in Manhattan in 1741. 31 Negroes and 5 whites, 2 of them were women, were executed for participating in that uprising. In the South, many slave revolts took place even during the colonial period. Several slaves were burned to death after an unsuccessful revolt took place near Charleston, South Carolina. 10 years later, another serious uprising in South Carolina was crushed. Then again in 1739, South Carolina was the scene of 3 massive revolts among slaves. 3 19th century slave revolts deserve special mention. On September 1st, 1800, 1,100 slaves set out to destroy Richmond, Virginia. The force, led by Gabriel Prosser and Jack Bowler, planned a 3-pronged attack on the town. While rain-swollen streams delayed the attack, 2 Negro slaves revealed the plot. Prosser was captured 2 months later, and Bowler and 33 other Negroes Bowler and 33 other slaves were executed. In 1800, Denmark Vesey of Charleston, South Carolina, bought his freedom for $600. Later, he worked as a carpenter in the area and used his spare time to study the French Revolution and the successful revolts in Haiti. In 1822, after 22 years of planning and study, Vesey organized a slave plot aimed at the seizure of Charleston, but Vesey, like Prosser, was betrayed by a slave who informed his master. Authorities arrested 139 Negroes and executed 47 of them, including Vesey, who was a free man at the time. 37 other Negroes were banished from the United States, and 4 white men who had encouraged VC were fined and imprisoned. The third major slave revolt of the 19th century was led by Nat Turner. Turner was a mystic, and his actions were based on a vision that he had been selected by God to lead the slaves against their white oppressors. What became known as the Southampton County Insurrection was, if not the largest, the most violent slave revolt in the history of this country. Turner masterminded the rebellion, but his strategy was directed by his visions and the heavenly voices he heard rather than by logic and reason. Leading a small band of slaves, he descended on Southampton County, Virginia, on the night of August 21st, 1831. The first victims were his master and the 4 members of his household. Taking arms and recruiting slaves as they went, the small group soon grew into a well armed band of about 70 men. They marched toward the county seat, killing white slaveholders and their families as they encountered them. In all, Turner's band killed 10 men, 14 women, and 35 children. When the revolt was finally broken on August 22nd, 1831, Turner went into hiding for 2 months. During this time, the entire South was in turmoil, fearing a full-scale revolution. Not until his capture and execution on November 11th did the situation quiet down. It took 3,000 troops and 2 months to track down this prophet of freedom, and even after his death, the nation remained troubled. Nat Turner's revolt demonstrated to the whites of America, both in the North and South, that many Negroes were willing to kill and die to achieve freedom. The nation was to debate this issue for many years and to face the same problem again with John Brown's raid, but not until the Civil War was the issue to be met head on. Revolts were not the only means Negroes used to rebel against captivity. Every conceivable form of resistance was employed, including work slowdowns, infanticide, sabotage, suicide, and escape. Some writers in the early 19th century refer to the impossibility of forcing Negro slaves to work to capacity except when working for themselves. In the fields, they had to be watched constantly and supervised by plantation overseers. Yet, when Negroes cultivated their own land or were working toward buying their own or a relative's freedom, their efficiency often surprised slaveholders. Malingering or feigning sickness was a favorite device used by the slave to avoid working the white man's fields. Petty sabotage in the form of breaking and misusing tools or laming animals and more serious acts such as arson and poisoning were further evidence of the Negro's protest against servitude. Infanticide and suicide were widely used as demonstrative, as a demonstration of rebellion. Mothers frequently smothered their newborn children rather than see them grow up slaves, and suicide was prevalent enough to be singled out by plantation owners and clergy as the worst of crimes. Those who destroyed themselves were denied Christian burial or any official observance of their passing. And that is the end of sections 1 and 2. We'll be reading section 3 tomorrow, Toward Abolition. But did you have any comments? Because as you can see, slavery was about the economics of it. They were just financially greedy and they did horrible, heinous things to us in order to make it profitable for them. They would marry white women, poor white women to black men. They would punish any upper class white woman who wanted to be with a white man, but the white man who wanted to be with a black man, but the white man had free reign and access to black women. And as we learned yesterday, white men feel like they can take any woman that they want without fear of repercussion. Forecast says this is a great book, a lot of great information. He's glad I chose this one. Well, thank you so much, Forecast. All right, guys. Well, yeah, just remember that they are not our friends. Just remember, they are not our friends. They will do anything because, again, Ida B. Wells tells us that the dollar is the white man's God. That's all they worship. And in pursuit of that dollar, they will do heinous things even to other white people. So if they'll do those heinous things to other white people, what do you imagine they'll do to you? I want to say thank you to Brother Bakari, Anthony McPhail, and the Forecast for being here. I know that Koku is listening from the Bitter Medicine Podcast. I know that Oni is listening from the Pro Black Perspective. I know Sister Raw and the elders are listening. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. Afro Native is listening. Dorico Cooper is listening. Tinkerbell 87 is listening. I know that the staff at the Daycares Ladies Network and the staff at Jesse's Kids are listening, and so many others. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here, and I'll be back tomorrow reading Section 3, Toward Abolition, or Abolition as We Saw the Fight. But remember, when you read slave narratives, so many of them talk about, like William Wells Brown, especially, has so many odes and poems to Queen Victoria because they felt that England was really the black man's home because in England they could be free when they couldn't be free here. So, and they didn't have chattel slavery the same. They had a form of chattel slavery, but they got rid of it there before they got rid of it here. And so there was this dream that if I could just get to England, I could be free. All right, guys. But Brother Bakari says they still don't have fear in 2024. They need to have fear. You shouldn't fear the white man. You should be armed and not trust them. All right, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.